next up is motor mounting. So get out bag H, and there's a little bag in there with a bunch of screws and parts. Again, put those in a tray. You've got your one-way and your sleeve. That's your auto rotation, by the way. Interesting, it's not in the main gear, it's on the motor. 4 screws, 4 washers. This is what will be mounting the motor. Now, in the manual, they show you mounting the motor with the motor mount in. And I'm going to do it a little differently, and I'll tell you why. Also, I've got my main belt out. As you saw before in the tail build, I built it off the heli. Again, I think this is going to be the best way. That way we can get the motor in, the belt's not in our way, main gear's not in our way, and then once we get the motor in, we can get all the belt and main gear on, which I'll show when we come back to set belt tension, but and have that all in. The other thing is, I'm going to find this easier to pull the motor mount out. You have to slide it all the way forward and then down, and you can get it back in with the motor on, and I'll show you that. And the reason I want to do that is because I'm going to make a slight modification myself. I'm going to go ahead and bolt this on just like the instructions say. 4 screws and washers. You really can't mess it up because there's 4. It just kind of centers the motor up in the motor mounting plate. I'm also going to mount my motor so that the wires are coming out this back corner here. Okay, that way I can come around the connectors. I'm going to put my ESC up in here, so that'll give me, you know, I won't have to jam these up anywhere. So I just think it makes a good run. All right, so I'm going to mount it that way, and then, which means the motor mount's going to be like this. Okay, so wires out near this corner. All right, and then the reason I'm doing this is because when we go to put this all on, they want this bolted down, and when you attach this to the motor shaft, they want you to leave at least 1 millimeter of clearance, okay? And what I'm going to do is get the motor mount on, get this in, get the set screws, and make marks on the shaft, and then I'm going to put flat spots on the motor shaft. And that way you don't, there's no chance of slipping. Not saying it's going to slip with 2 set screws, but I like, I don't want to take the chance. I like flat spots. So once I get that marked and on there, and I'll show that, then I'm just going to take a Dremel with a cutoff wheel, and you go at a very low speed, and you just go back and forth like this, and you make your flat spot. Now, I'm only going to make 1 flat spot for 1 set screw. The other one I'm not. And the reason I am not is with 2 set screws, you got to make sure your flat spots are properly lined up. If one's cocked so that the set screw's sitting at an angle, then the flat spot's not really doing anything. It can walk, okay? So I'm only going to put 1 flat spot on my shaft, and the other one I'm going to tighten up. All right, so let's go ahead and get this mounted on a motor mount, and we'll come back and continue. Okay, so got the motor mounted, and actually let me talk about something here. Quickie tutorial on set screws. Okay, some set screws, if you look at the end of them, they have a cup. Okay, those are called, I've always been told they're called dog ears. If you notice, the cup has a very sharp edge around it. The purpose of that is when you tighten up, the cup cuts a ring into the shaft that you're tightening up on and will leave a ring mark, and that's how they work. It seats into that ring, and now the set screw won't slip on whatever you're on. However, some things like hardened shafts like this, it won't touch them. And what happens is, as a matter of fact, I did not leave a mark on mine, and what happens is in the attempt to try and tighten it up, it now dulls the cup sharpness on here, so you shouldn't reuse this type. If you don't have a flat spot on your motor, you tighten this up and it makes that ring and bites into the shaft to hold. If you take it out later and try to reuse it and try to cut a new cup, unless you can get it perfectly lined up on the old cup mark on the shaft, you shouldn't reuse these. They'll slip, okay? So it's important to understand that. Again, this is why I'm going to put 1 flat spot in. I went ahead and put this on and left the 1 millimeter gap, okay, just kind of eyeballed it, and I went and tightened up the set screw really good, and as you see, because of the hardness of the shaft, it did not leave a ring on the shaft, okay. I was hoping to mark the shaft on where to put my flat spot. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go ahead and take the set screw out. I'm going to remember this one is going to go where my flat spot's going to be because I've dulled it now. As a matter of fact, if you look close, you can see it is dulled now. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in here, take a Sharpie, and put a mark on the shaft where the flat spot needs to be. Okay, so do that. We'll come back and make the flat spot. Okay, so there we go. I had to take the motor mount back off because you got to be able to get in there with whatever you're going to use to put a flat spot on, that 1 millimeter or that that distance is rather close to the motor mount. So you can see my Sharpie mark where I just stuck a pen through one of the set screw holes once I had it 1 millimeter away from the motor mount, and that's where we need to put our flat spot. We don't need to make it gigantic or anything. And what I like to do is just cut off disc at a low speed. Okay, if you want to use a file or something, this is a hardened shaft. It'll take you a while. But what you do is you get your mark and you just work back and forth like so. And just do it slowly. We're not trying to cut into the shaft. We just need a flat spot. Okay? If you're unsure that your mark is absolutely perfect, you can make the flat spot a little wider. And I'll show you here in a minute. It doesn't take much. Okay, bear with. Okay, and there we go. We've got a nice flat spot there on the shaft for the set screw to set in. I'm going to put everything together, test fit, make sure that I've got it in the right spot, but basically that's it. You don't need a big, gigantic flat spot to have that set screw hold. All right, so that's basically it. We'll go ahead and get the motor back in and get it in the heli. By the way, another quick tip. Once you get all 4 screws in, I left them loose. You can see the plate moves around a little bit on the screws. Best bet is just look down in the hole of the motor mount plate and the bearing in the motor and just kind of get that bearing centered up in there and then tighten them up. And again, I do it a little bit at a time in a star fashion. Okay, and then go around again and tighten them up all the way. Alright, so go ahead and do that. That makes sure you're centered in your motor mount plate. I don't think it's really, those tolerances aren't really that much, but you know, it's good just to make sure you're nice and centered in the hole. Alright, so we'll get this in the heli and continue on. Okay, here's my little trick for getting this motor mount back in with the motor on it. You can't do it with the pinion on, but you can without the pinion. It's pretty straightforward. Feed the wires through the side. You're going to come out through, and you'll notice there's a flange for the back motor mount screw that won't allow the motor mount to come up, but the front one doesn't have these. So what you're going to do is you got to move the motor all the way forward. Okay, get it centered between the frames up here. Okay, and it'll just go at that point with the motor all the way forward. Bear with me here. Okay, and then you can slide it back over those flanges, okay, and that gets it lined up for the screws, all right? Then what we're going to do is go ahead and put the motor mount screws back in, leave them loose, and we'll come back and we'll put this pinion on. Okay, next up is to go ahead and put the drive pulley on. Now the manual says when you put this on that you want it to spin free when you're looking down on it in a clockwise direction. And there's another way to tell as well. There's some writing. Let me double check that it's correct. Yeah. There's some writing on one side. If you look inside the one-way bearing that's inside this pulley, you'll see rotation direction, okay? And the other side doesn't have that writing. All right, so if you put that writing up, you're good to go. So basically, remember where that writing is. Put your bearings on, okay? Keep that up. Double check when you put it on here that if you're holding the motor, you can spin this pulley freely in a clockwise direction. Alright, so the next step is basically put this washer on. Now try not to get that washer into the groove on this shaft because it'll give you a hard time trying to get the E-clip on. I call it an E-clip because it looks like an E to me. Some people call them C-clips, I guess. And then basically if you have an insertion tool, fine, but you should find that you can push this on usually if that washer isn't fouled in there, usually by hand with your thumb. If not, be very careful putting it on, squeezing it on with a pair of pliers. If you don't get it and you slip, ping, it shoots across the room and then you're kicking yourself because you don't have one. Alright, so basically at this point, go ahead and feed your belt up and around the pulley and then go ahead and get it around your main gear and everything here. Hold on. Alright. And we're gonna leave the motor loose and we're gonna leave the boom loose. But one thing you want to check, and I talked about this before, was the manual had you put the boom on and the belt and the main gear earlier. I just went ahead and put my boom on because I built it off the heli, and but since we need to do this now, we need to get everything lined up. So I went ahead and fed it in, put my main gear on, my main belt, and what you want to double check is that when you rotate the head in a clockwise fashion, okay, that the tail rotor turns in an anti-clockwise fashion. Alright, so make sure you've got your belt right with no twists. Make sure the belt's around the pulleys back here in the back and that everything's lined up, because when we come back we're going to do belt tension. Alright, so let's get that ready and we'll come back and do it. Okay, belt tension adjustment and some tips for you. Alright, I've kind of looked at this and played with this a little bit, but there's two adjustments to the belt, and you got to have both of these loose. If you just move the motor somewhere and then try to adjust this one, you might get too much slack on one side than the other. They have to work together because this is all cogged together with the belt. So you got to make sure you move, when you move one, you move the other in unison so that the belt's tight evenly on both sides. You don't have a slacky side or it's trying to jump teeth or anything. Alright, the next thing is this idler pulley that's in here near the motor. Its purpose is to get the belt to wrap more around the motor pinion than if it was just coming around like this. If it was just coming around at this angle here and back, then you'd only engage so many teeth. Well, this idler pulley brings that up, and it helps keep the belt from flapping on the loose non-drive side. Okay, this would be the coming inside, this would be the going outside. So that's its purpose. So one of the things we want to do is we want to make sure we don't have our motor, and bear with me here, see how it does that? You got to make sure your teeth are lined up. We don't want our motor too far forward, but also I'm finding that all the way back isn't that great because it tends to, that belt's really coming around those two pulleys rather tightly. So a little bit forward, all right? And then playing around with this, we also don't want our pulleys here too close to the main gear because now it's making a very tight turn around these pulleys. So I'm just going to tell you what I found that I think is optimal, at least with my belt setup. So I'm going to bring the boom back. If you'll notice the plastic molding here for the pulley assembly and then the curved plastic area for the frame. Not quite to that point, just a hair of that sticking out, maybe a millimeter or two. That should center it up. And then also before you snug these up, and just snug them up for now, also notice that there's a little bit of lateral play, all right? You want to make sure when this is rotating that that belt is not riding on the top or the bottom of the pulley. So move this around. What I found was I biased it down, okay, and then went ahead and snugged it up, and that's where my belt rode. All right, so go ahead, get the boom snugged up at about this point, about 1 or 2 millimeters of the curvature of the tail pulley assembly sticking out from the frame just a little bit, all right? So I'm going to go ahead and snug those up for now, and then we'll make sure our motor's moved to where our belt is now lined up and tight and pretty close, all right? And then we're going to go ahead and tighten this stuff up. So go ahead and get to that step, and we'll continue. Okay, so we've got our boom snugged down. I can still move it a little bit. We got our motor biased forward, so our belt is about where we want it. And again, this is a double adjustment. You're going to tighten up the boom belt first, because the belt can't jump teeth right now. If we move too much, like a ton, then we're going to need to loosen both up, and it'll jump a tooth on the pinion. So I'd say if you got to move more like that right there, we're going to have a belt problem, and it's going to want to jump a pinion. But since we got it about where we want it, and we've got our motor bias so the belt is almost the right tightness, I'm just going to snug one motor screw up for now because we're going to come back to that. And our boom is about where we want it. Okay, so now we're setting the boom belt tightness. Again, we're only moving a little bit to tighten it up. So this is kind of my relaxed point here, and as you can hear, the belt's ringing in the boom. So we're going to tighten that up, and just a little movement. As you saw, I moved that maybe a millimeter. Okay, just to where the belt is not ringing in the boom. Okay, but that you spin freely. See that? Nice and free. Nice and free. Okay? All right? So, but you don't want the belt to ring. And also, again, if you have to move this too much, then you may have to relax up here and get it to jump a tooth, okay? But it's just get the right amount so you're not ringing. Then go ahead and at this point tighten up your boom in a cross pattern position. This is all plastic. You don't want to tweak anything, all right? And go ahead and tighten up your boom so it can't slip. Okay, we're doing what's called fine adjustment to the belt, not coarse, where we're moving this stuff all around. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Not ringing. Actually, I'm a little too loose. I am ringing a little bit. No, I think I'm all right. All right, so now that we've got that and we tighten up the boom, now again, we're not moving this motor a ton. If you're moving this motor around a ton, you're going to have a belt lineup problem. So again, now all we're going to do is we're going to check our belt tension here. Okay, and make sure we got the 2 to 3 millimeters. Looks like I'm about good. Try loosening that up just a hair. I like my belts on a little on the loose side, but you also don't want them jumping. Yeah, see, that's too much. It's hard to show this on video because it's the amount of force versus the amount of movement. Okay, just tighten it up just a hair more. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let me just tighten one to check. Check. Tighten one so it doesn't move. Then spin and check that everything's cool. Okay, nice and free. The belt isn't trying to do anything weird. Belt's riding in the center of the idler pulleys, etc., etc. So again, just to summarize, it is a push-pull thing. Get them close, bias them out, make sure the belt is even tension on both sides, and then go ahead, tighten back here first. Again, you're just doing fine adjustment of the belt for the tail, and then you're going to do the fine adjustment for the belt tension on the motor. All right, if you moved either one too much, there's a good chance you may have to realign your belt again and start over. So hope that makes sense. It is a kind of a double adjustment. It may sound like this is a pain in the neck, but it really is not that hard. You'll see once you move the stuff around that when you get down to it, you're just doing fine adjustments. All right, so that finishes motor installation and belt tension.